The morning began like nearly every morning over the past 3 months, with incessant rain. The constant grating monotony of raindrops on the stretched hide of Hassan's tent had become an unrelenting opponent in his struggle to remain asleep within the warm confines of his fur-lined covers. The thrumming assault was tenacious, and he'd lost his ability to ignore it weeks ago. It was a battle of wills deciding which displeasure was least objectionable, the constant drumming or the cold damp chill outside should he finally give in and rise. Neither seemed bearable at the moment, but after 2 hours of tossing and turning he was ready for a change. A dank, musty smell greeted Hassan as he pulled the covers from over his head. It appeared within the first week of setting camp here and had only grown more pungent since. The finely oiled leather of the tent had kept its walls safe from the encroachment of rotten mildew, but among the possessions he kept within, there were clear victims. Hassan was immediately assailed by the damp clinging chill that never subsided in the air. It was almost enough to make him crawl back under the warmth of his blankets and hide for what remained of the day. After an exaggerated struggle, he managed to drag himself from the tangle of covers. Newly exposed skin drew taut across his muscular frame and prickled as the cold invaded deeper, but before long he was on his feet, stretching to work the blood back into his extremities. After a bit of a search, Hassan came across a wrinkled tan shirt not yet pocked with the black touch of mildew and a pair of reasonably dry hide pants that only showed minor signs of cracking. He fumbled with the laces and ties with hands still dulled from sleep, but eventually managed to dress. If he had access to a larger mirror, and perhaps if he wasn't so miserable he didn't care, he might have noticed how disheveled he appeared. The rummaged articles of clothing were badly wrinkled, colors splotchy where wetness had invaded. They hung limply across his broad shoulders and sleek, toned figure, as if they shared his dismay at facing the weather outside. He gave a slightly greater effort with his hair. The single small hand glass he owned revealed a frazzled, sandy blonde mess that all too closely resembled the mane of a briar cat with the mange. Appalled, he combed back the evident ravages of his damp slumber with his fingers. The sides and back had been shaved recently, enough that only soft stubble had grown, but the majority of it hung down several hands below his shoulders. This he pulled back taut into a ponytail, with a quick and practiced braiding, and bound it with a leather strap. He lamented the faded pallor of his skin. His once deep tan, a trait born from long days in the sun, was another victim lost to this blasted mire. Even Hassan's hazel eyes, said to mirror the golden vastness of his homeland, appeared dim and unremarkable. Soon, he assured himself, winter would end, and this misery would finally be over. But his affirmation didn't have the bolstering effect he hoped. For 5 years now, his people were forced to flee the harshness of the highlands winter to this coastal valley, and each spring seemed to arrive a little later. The tribe of the Conchegal wasn't built for this place, Hassan in particular among them. He was made for the rugged vastness of the highlands plateaus. His body was forged in the searing sun and arid sands, his soul a product of unbounded vastness and freedom. The old winter havens had grown more harsh and inhospitable recently, and even the resiliency of the Conchegal wasn't enough to find sustenance there anymore. So each year, Hassan found himself exiled in misery to this wretched swamp. Resigned to his fate, Hassan unclasped the entrance to his tent and stepped into the disheartening grey bleakness waiting outside. He was greeted by a faint squishing sound as his shoes sank deep into the pool of muddy ooze. There was nowhere safe to step. The pathways, which ran like a grid through the numerous tents of the camp, had become rivers of the same offending sludge. A steady cadence of slurping filled the air as members of his tribe slogged their way down the trails on some errand or daily chore. The effort so consumed them that no one even acknowledged his presence. Hassan wasn't the only one feeling the effects of winter exile. If this was a morning in the highlands, he would have been met with the dull clamor of bustling life and greeted warmly by everyone he passed. But a hush had settled over the camp, only broken by the constant squelching of footfalls. To Hassan's amazement, the rain subsided, just more confirmation its only purpose was to taunt him. Even without the accursed rain, the world was a drab and dreary sight. The ashen hue of the cloud-laden sky hung oppressively low over the trees around him, their naked branches reaching ever skyward to form a dark skeletal silhouette. The filth of the mud-filled pathways had spread from its source, splattered profusely over the tan-hide walls of almost every tent. Even the constant deluge had been unable to wash away the clotted mess. The entirety of the portrait was depressing to behold. Hassan couldn't help envisioning his people transformed by this place into nothing more than pigs in a wallow. Spring will come. We'll leave soon, Hassan told himself once more. But the words were empty, and he felt his spirits wither even more as he tromped out into the endless slippery mire. There was no purpose or direction behind his meandering. He wandered gloomily through the camp, searching for some temporary cure to his melancholy. The training yard seemed like a possibility at first, but his blade was back in the tent, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed away in its case. Besides, the prospect of trying to maneuver in this muck wasn't encouraging, so he instead began to seek out a morning campfire that hadn't been doused. Perhaps something fresh from the flames could expel the pervasive cold from his insides. Like tea. Despite his great reluctance to, Hassan veered towards the center of camp. With any luck, there would still be a few steaming pots and kettles there churning out a sizzling morsel or two. It was in the camp's heart that the grand hall, the communal gathering place for his tribe, stood. Most mornings, nearly the entire population amassed in the enormous tent, or to share breakfast and chant about the coming day. That place, in particular, triggered Hassan's reluctance. Having just turned 16 as winter set in, he was now considered a man and thus prime husband material, for any family looking to marry off a daughter. The sudden intention this new status ignited left him with a bit of trepidation at the idea of being social. It wasn't that he had no interest in girls, far from it. However, the constant push to marry him off led to an outright boycott of the Grand Hall. Even being in its vicinity risked drawing notice, so as he neared the inner square, he slipped in and out of the narrow alleys between tents, relying on his nose to guide him to a campfire still capable of yielding warm breakfast. Success. Not far from where he hid behind the wall of the large tent, a pan sat untended by the fire. Crisp bacon spat and crackled within, and several loaves of bread were crusting up nicely near the flames. It was only 10 feet there and back, all of it in the open. Such a reward was worth the risk, however. A lifetime of stalking prey in the waste had honed Hassan's skill to stealth into an art form. He employed them now to slide soundlessly from concealment towards the most mouth-watering target. The slurping of his boots vanished as he navigated every obstacle, flowing like a shadow, through boxes and crates to come within reach of his prize, and then... Hassan! The call brought him up short, mere inches away from snatching his crisp, salty prize. His stomach rumbled in protest, as the bounty denied. For a second, Hassan considered continuing with his pilferage, despite the interruption. However, the unknown voice hadn't simply named him, but had used the dread honorific that marked him as the son of the tribe's chieftain. That left only a few possibilities as to its source. There was his father, the Kara, but he only used Hassan's full title when scolding or when official predicate required. Besides, Hassan was fairly certain he would recognize his own father's voice. There was father's councilman, who used it almost religiously in deference to his father. Beyond that, very few of his people acknowledged his title. Then they were all as close-knit as family. Hassan was less the great chief's son and more the rambunctious boy who stole their bacon. It turned out to be none of those, but a different menace altogether. As Hassan turned, he met the sly, twinkling gray eyes and age-worn face of old Dern peeking out from where he crouched between two small tents on the far side of the fire. Hassan assumed, by the way the old coot had positioned himself, that he too was also intent on liberating a few bites from the poorly tended cook fire. Breakfast theft was a characteristic they shared. "Help a poor, old, famished man out, won't you, boy?" Dern whispered from his hiding place. "Grab a few extra slices of that there bacon in one of those loaves and bring it here for me. My rickety old bones can't carry me like they used to." He gestured to hurry, then followed it up with one of his signature clever grins. The absurdity of it was almost too much for Hassan to bear, and he had to bite his tongue to prevent himself from laughing. Hassan knew old Dern was perfectly capable of getting the food himself. Despite his protestations, he was just as agile and spry as almost everyone in the camp, perhaps even more so. He defied his age, though the signs of passing were written clearly on his body for all to see. But this was his game as he saw it. Why do with your body what your brain can get done for you quicker, and with less fuss, he always said. So Hassan found himself recruited to snatch not only his breakfast, but the old man's as well. It wasn't the first time he'd been conscripted in this way, and he was certain it wouldn't be the last. After a quick perusal, Hassan found a suitable plate to hold his larger-than-intended cargo. In a mere instant he had it loaded and was swiftly fleeing the scene, with old Dern, despite his claim of frailty, keeping pace with ease right behind him. They escaped to the outer edges of the camp without drawing much attention, although 2 sentries, frequent witnesses of this familiar caper, chuckled and continued on their rounds. Once within the seclusion of the surrounding forests, Hassan and Dern slowed to a steady amble, as they sought a place to divide and partake of the spoils. "Nice footwork, boy," old Dern chided. "You could use a little lighter step, though. Look as if you rolled all the way here." Hassan looked down to discover he was covered in mud and splatter. Thankfully, the food was untouched for the most part, but Hasan was still disappointed he'd unknowingly abandoned his careful strides in their recent flight. Even more egregious was the fact that old Dern showed no signs at all of their escape. His dull brown robes were completely untouched by a single drop of mud. That same clever, taunting grin he always gave was there to emphasize that fact. "How did you—" Hasan stammered. He knew by now to expect the unbelievable from old Dern, but even after all this time, he still underestimated him. His perception of Dern as a decrepit old goat always seemed to leave him astonished at the feats he was capable of. But that was the way the game was played, as Dern told it. His disguise of senility was that what blunted the tempers of those whose campfires he pillaged and lowered the expectations of others. The old man's transgressions were considered just part of everyday life among the camp. They were rarely as forgiving of Hasan. "Always know your opponent, Hasan," Dern replied in a lecturing tone, then hobbled melodramatically over to a fallen tree to take a seat. He chuckled to himself the whole way there as Hasan glared. It was amazing how effortlessly he donned the guise of a haggard cripple once more. Hasan could only follow, finally laughing at his foolishness as well. They were an odd pair perched there on that log, ravenously devouring their bread and bacon. One was at the pinnacle of his youth, toned muscle evident through his mud-laden clothes, and the other a worn testament to the cumulative cost of a long, hard life. The thin, white wisps of Dern's hair that remained were always disheveled, but far too few to impact his overall clean-cut appearance. Despite his vagabond demeanor, there wasn't a speck of stubble among the multitude of creases and wrinkles that made up his face. His steely eyes always appeared to gleam with an intense cunning, even crowded as they were by the folds of drooping skin that threatened to overtake them. When his lips weren't posed in that sly, mocking grin, they were tightly pursed as if bound internally in deep contemplation. The light brown pelted robes he wore were almost always immaculate, except, of course, when a little dirt was needed to engender extra sympathy. He was thin and wiry like most men his age, but he was far from soft and saggy. Hasan, having encountered Dern's unlikely strength, imagined that although the muscle may have faded, beneath those robes he was all sinew and gristle. As Hasan licked the remaining grease and crumbs from his fingers, he realized his good fortune. Though it was true old Dern could be an annoyance, with the limited options available on a day like today, he was the perfect escape from Hasan's current boredom. No one was quite certain of Dern's age, but everyone was fully aware of the vast knowledge of depth about the ages. The vast depth of knowledge about the ages contained within his mind. The places he must have seen, the things he must have done, the possibilities were infinite, and so were his stories. Old Dern, as the eldest of their tribe, saw himself as the only obvious tutor for the young among them. He taught his lessons through stories and legends. It was a risk Hasan sought mystical stories of gods and magic before, only to be granted an hour-long diatribe on the various peculiarities of the world's cultures. With luck, Dern wouldn't be inclined towards the latter today. To his surprise, Hasan didn't even have to make a request. Having finished his makeshift bacon sandwich, Dern assumed the posture of yet another of his many personas, the mentor. "You've been missing from the Grand Hall of late. Do you now resent the companionship of your people and your duties to them?" It wasn't an accusation, so much as cunningly plotted barb meant to spur a more passionate response. Hasan was used to this kind of tactic. It was typical Dern. Everything he did, down to the looks he gave you, was carefully plotted to manipulate towards some hidden motive. "I don't resent anything," Hasan countered. "I'm just sick of being ogled by every girl and their mother like I'm some prize to be won. Last week, Savette stopped me to ask if I found it cold in my covers all alone at night. Then she winked at me. Her daughter's only 14. Old Dern exploded in a roar of laughter. It wasn't uncommon for him to find great amusement in the perceived travesties of youth, and he seemed to take great pleasure in mocking Hasan's personal woes most of all. It was like that in all of their interactions. Of all his young pupils, he was hardest on Hasan. "Suck it up, boy. You are a prize. You are the chieftain's son." Dern paused for a moment, then shook his head slowly and continued. "You may not like it, and you may want to avoid it, but it is your duty as Ka to act in the best interest of your people. I don't see what the best interest of the people has to do with me having a wife. I think getting out of this blasted swamp would be the best thing I could do for them." "You don't get it, do you?" Dern asked, looking inquiringly at his pupil. "We come to this place because we will die if we stay in the Highlands. We do it because your father has commanded it, and he commands it because it is in the best interest of the tribe's future." There was another brief pause as Dern ascertained whether everything was sinking in. "Now, the way your people see it, you having a wife means an heir. Of course, an heir ensures your line for the future. It's all for the betterment of the tribe, whether you wish it to or not." It didn't come out like scolding. It was simply Dern, the teacher, correcting a foolish pupil. with more logical rationale. But is it not more important to the tribe that I take my time and choose a wife worthy of a chieftain? Hasan had matched wits with the old man before. Although he often lost in the end, he was perfectly capable of holding his own. There was undeniable logic in his answer. A poor choice in a wife could end up being more harmful to the tribe than him not choosing one at all. To emphasize his point, Hasan used Durn's own words to reinforce his case. Don't you always tell me if it's important, then it's worth taking your time, so you do it right? Durn nodded in approval, but his silence only lasted a moment. It appeared he was not only prepared for this answer, but led Hasan to it on purpose. Quite right, you are, boy, but Durn's praise was almost always blunted by a further contraction. It is imperative you choose the right wife. However, how can you choose when you don't look at what options are available? What is it your people think when they see you hiding in your tent? Do you think they see a future leader who is taking his time and carefully considering what's best for his people? Or do they see a young man who refuses to accept his responsibilities and hides from them like a child? Though there wasn't a single hint of malice in his voice, Durn's words bit deep. Hasan knew he was being petty by avoiding the Grand Hall. It simply seemed easier coming up with a multitude of excuses to extricate himself time and time again from the overbearing mother-daughter teams. He understood the responsibilities to the tribe and usually was fully willing to comply with them to the best of his abilities. But there was something else Durn's admonition touched on, and it made him a little uncomfortable. Hasan did somewhat resent the trappings of his position. He'd watched his father lead the tribe for years, always with their best interest in mind and rarely changing. The Conchogal were a strong, proud people with so much potential, and yet they had a purpose so vague it was never truly put to full use. They wandered and they survived. Hasan wanted so much more than that in his life and for them. If he was to lead his people, he wanted to lead them to greatness. But that wasn't their way. It was no surprise Durn's prodding awakened these feelings. The simple fact that it was Durn's doing meant the old man intended things to go this way. And that made it even more likely their chance encounter this morning was less accidental than it seemed. Old Durn's piercing glare finally drew Hasan from his reverie. The old man peered at him as if to make certain his pupil had reached the right point in his thoughts before proceeding. He nodded in satisfaction, then continued with his next act of mental puppetry. I understand what you were going through. You've become a man, and even though it has been ages since I became a man, I remember the needs and desires that come with it. Durn chuckled to himself for a moment, reminiscing on the days of his youth so long ago. You want to conquer the world with your newfound freedom, but you feel bound to a destiny unworthy of you because of the duty that comes with your heritage. What you need to realize, though, is that each man creates his own destiny no matter the dictates he must live by. Chieftain or peasant, each man has the same potential for greatness, and you have a greater advantage than most in finding it, for your birthright guides you. You are next in line to lead the Conchogal to their destiny. What destiny? We wander the lands aimlessly and we do what we must to survive. There's no greatness in that. Only monotony. Hasan knew it wasn't the best answer, but Durn's satisfied grin confirmed everything was going as planned, and he'd fallen into yet another of the old goat's traps. Did you forget every one of your lessons, boy? There was vehemence in his voice, but a smirk on his lips. The very name Conchogal defines our purpose. Do you need me to teach you again how we came to be? Must I resort to reciting children's tales to refresh your memory? We are the Conchogal, the seekers of the lost, Hasan interjected hastily. He wanted to end the chastisement, but he was immediately uncertain of his answer. This was no longer just a contest of wills. There was a purpose behind his whole for charade, and if Hasan couldn't recover it soon, the badgering would never end. He tilted his head down as if pondering something, an unspoken request for a temporary truce. Durn nodded in quiet acceptance of the familiar sign and granted a short reprieve. Stomach acid and saliva overload. Hasan thought back on the path of the conversation so far and tried to find some clue as to where he was being led. Durn mentioned children's tales, but surely those weren't the answers. Our very name defines our purpose. Conchogal, the seekers of the lost. Correction. Durn was very adamant those many years ago. The direct translation wasn't seekers of the lost. It was more like the seekers of the greatness lost. Even that didn't seem to shed any more light on the subject. For his entire life, his people traveled the lands, and he couldn't remember ever finding any greatness. So what was the greatness lost? There were, of course, Durn's tales of gods and magic. The lands and feats he described could easily be referred to as a greatness lost. But even were they true, each story ended with the same admonition. Hasan heard it so many times growing up he could recite it by heart. The gods were dead and gone forever from our world, and mankind was left to find their destiny without the comfort of their once protectors. But then, humans never really needed gods in the first place. At least so they believed. It was nearly the same ending for all of Durn's stories. The gods thrown down by their disciples, and mankind joyous that they were finally free to decide their fates. At times it seemed like the tales praised the casting down of some long-forgotten deity, while others seemed like woe-begotten tragedies mourning something the world would never see again. Either way, there always seemed to be some hint that mankind didn't truly comprehend the consequences of the rebellion so many ages ago. But victory or tragedy, the result was still the same. The gods were no more. That was the purpose of looking for something that what was the purpose of looking for something that no longer existed? The more he thought about the answers, the more questions piled up. Had he somehow missed out on an important lesson that would have solved the entire matter? Or had his earlier education truly been that lacking in substance? It galled him that these gaps in his knowledge existed for this long without realizing it. He'd accepted it all without question and spent his life believing in something he never truly understood. Old Durn was watching him intently, debating whether his pupil had reached the right level of understanding. As they locked eyes, he grinned. This time there was a hint of consolation, but the usual smugness was still very evident. "Do you admit defeat?" Hassan could only nod in acquiescence. "Very good, then." Durn stopped and seemed to consider his next words carefully, as if for the first time today he didn't have them planned ahead of time. "You show great promise, Hassan. I didn't have to argue with you. I provided you the direction, and you found the answers by yourself." "I didn't find any answers, just more questions." "Don't interrupt," Durn waved him off absently. "The fact that you are capable of understanding there were only questions to be found is what's important. This spring, the tribes of Conchogal from all across the lands will come together for the Dahara. It comes once every 10 years. You were only 6 for the last one, so I doubt you have much memory of it. But there are things you must learn before you attend the next." Durn was right. While Hassan had a vague memory of his camp sprawled as far as the eye could see, very little detail remained. He had faint glimpses of immense fires with dancing and music, but he could never forget all the people. Hundreds of Conchogal had ceased their endless wandering and come together for the celebration. Hassan wasn't ignorant of the Dahara. Even those who'd never been to one had heard the stories of past gatherings. The 10 clans of the Conchogal gathered upon a sacred plateau for 1 month every 10 years. Their chieftains, the 9 Kahrale, and the chief of the entire Conchogal nation, the Kahra, would hold council during this month to decide laws, judge disputes, and ensure the leaders were engaged, and ensure the tribe's survival for the next 10 years to come. While their leaders were engaged in this grand feat, the people celebrated. They organized games and tournaments to test the strength and cunning of the greatest among them. Feasts were held by each tribe, highlighting the unique delicacies from the many lands they traversed. For those who experienced it, the Dahara was unlike anything else, and few nights went by within the Grand Hall without a tale or two of Dahara's past. "You will attend this year as a man for the first time," Durn continued. "As the son of the Kahra, chief of all chiefs, it is very important you are prepared for what's expected of you." "Why has nobody told me about this sooner?" Hassan demanded, alarmed by the sudden revelation. "Perhaps, my boy," Durn scolded lightheartedly, "had you been more concerned about your people than you were afraid of little girls, you might have been told months ago." "So what do I have to do?" The suspicion in Hassan's voice was evident. "To start, it's simple. You shut up, listen, and learn." Convinced his people would do as told, Durn continued. "I'm certain you recall learning of the great Ayum Ka, the first Seeker to be. But do you know why your forefather took up the title of Seeker?" Before Hassan even had a chance to answer, the peal of a horn blaring shook the forest tranquility. Birds erupted from the surrounding trees in flocks, shattering the eerie stillness. 2 more blasts echoed through the valley in succession, calling the Conchogal together. "Your father wishes to speak, it would seem," old Durn announced as he stood up from the log they had shared. He rubbed his backside for a moment, then turned to Hassan. "We can pick this discussion up later. Now hurry up, boy. This could be important." They returned in silence. Hassan was too consumed by the unanswered questions to think of anything else, quietly lamenting the delay in his education. As they re-entered the perimeter of the camp, they were joined by others making their way to the central square. A few faces showed concern, but the majority revealed excitement and anticipation. Had Hassan been less preoccupied, he might have shared in the eagerness, for this could be the announcement he was waiting for. The Conchogal were leaving this place. Progress slowed as the peaks of the Grand Hall came into view. Everyone had been funneling in since the summons, and the open square around the immense tent was already crowded. There was a cacophony of whispers and murmurs filling the air as people speculated on what they were about to hear. They all made way for Hassan, however, for his place was by his father at the center. Towering over the masses was the great Kahra Hassan, chief of the 10 clans and father to Hassan. He sat astride an immense mountain of solid horseflesh, shoulders several hands taller than the nearest onlookers. The stallion was a behemoth among horse kind. It was a Dohar, a breed of horse kept and bred by the Conchogal, only by the Conchogal. They were built to endure endless miles of riding, and were strong enough to pull 10 times their weight with ease, but their greatest asset was in their hiding prowess. In combat they became fearsome beasts, devotedly protective of their riders, but not even a briar cat would dare to challenge the might of a Dohar, and only the Conchogal could command them. The Kahra's presence wasn't diminished in the slightest by the mammoth stallion beneath him. He held himself tall and proud atop his steed, more monolithic than the beast he commanded. It was like looking into a mere reflection of Hassan's future self. His hair was the same sandy blonde, though his exalted status meant a much more elaborate styling. It was shaved in strips from front to back. The uncut segments were similarly pulled back and tied. However, his was elaborately braided with feathers, scales, and teeth, and hung to just below his waist. The tip was adorned with a frighteningly massive claw, more weapon than ornament. The Kahra's eyes were a shade darker, his body more solidly muscled, but no one could look upon the pair and see anything but father and son. Hassan was immediately troubled by the display before him. It was clear by both his father's outfit and demeanor this wasn't simply a declaration that they were pulling up camp. Kahra Hassan was equipped for battle. He was garbed in thick leather gear, and an array of blades was strapped about his person. The traditional 10-foot riding spear of the Conchogal loomed menacingly behind him, from a holster on his back, and if those weren't clues enough for Hassan, Cho'Gha, his father's arms-master, was at his side astride his own slightly smaller Dohar. If, in fact, small could even be used to describe one of these brutes. If the stern scowl of his father's face left any doubt of a potential threat, the menacingly eager smile on Cho'Gha's face quickly dispelled it. That man could smell when a fight was brewing and was always there when skulls needed cracking. Few were willing to risk his ire, and those who did usually didn't survive to regret it. He was a wall of muscles and scars, and looked as if he could even match a Dohar in strength, pound for pound. His hair was cut into a single charcoal strip that ran from his forehead back. The braid fell just short of rivaling Hassan's, proof of where he stood within the chain of command. Needless to say, if Cho'Gha was there, then a fight was likely to ensue in the near future. As the few remaining stragglers worked their way into the central square, Cho'Gha retrieved a horn from among the vast collection of deadly tools strapped to horse and rider. With one long, mournful blast, he called the tribe to attention. When the last of the echoes died, the camp stood enveloped in an uneasy silence. "My people," the Kahra commenced, his voice booming over the crowd. "Too long now have we remained tied to one place. I share in your discomfort, and also long for the hot open vastness of our ancestral lands. We are the Conchogal, born from the endlessness of traverse miles, not this sedentary existence. But the changing world has forced us to forsake our heritage for survival, long past the time when our hearts have grown heavy with longing. But I come to tell you our days of mud and rain have come to an end." An exultant cheer erupted at these words. "Na-ha-sa! Na-ha-sa! We ride," they cried in unison. The roar grew almost deafening, but Kahra Hassan didn't partake in this exultation. He stared across the masses of his people with a look of deep concern. He allowed them a moment to rejoice, then gestured for Cho'Gha to blow the horn again. Order was restored immediately. "I must warn you," the Kahra cautioned. "Though we will be leaving a land poorly suited to us, there will be greater hardships ahead than mere discomfort. My scouts tell me winter hasn't broken in the highlands. The sandstorms still rage, though less frequently, and the rains have yet to come even to the lowest of the steppes to bring renewal. I'm afraid we will be journeying into the same conditions we came here to escape, but I'm left with no other choice. If we are to reach the Dohara in time, we must break camp immediately." A faint murmur arose among the crowd at this revelation. It was a blending of boisterous dismissals and anxious uncertainty. After a few moments it died down, and the tribe was once again silently waiting on their chief to continue. "In truth, the Dohara is the least of my concerns. News has reached me that there is trouble brewing in the nearby port city. We don't know its source or if it could pose a threat, but I will be leaving to investigate as soon as we've finished here. Furthermore, I need to ask that you all remain alert. The sentries on the upper cliffs have captured someone who appeared to be spying on our location. While we don't have any information that would lead me to believe it was anything to do with the troubles in town, it is too coincidental to dismiss. So I repeat, stay sharp. There could be others. I want everyone ready to ride. If you finish beforehand, then set out for the upper pass, and we'll meet you with you there." Kahra Hassan stared out at the faces of his people, measuring their strengths and preparedness for what he believed was to come. Satisfied they were up to the challenge, he dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "Work quickly! For today the Conchogal will ride. A cheer went up once more as the crowd dispersed in all directions to begin the frenzy of breaking camp. Asan was stunned for a few moments as he tried to process everything he just heard. He expected to be excited they would finally be returning to the highlands, but the danger his father spoke of hung heavy over his emotions. Who would want to spy on the Conchogal? In his short life he'd never heard of such a thing, yet his father seemed certain. He was about to head for his tent when his earlier conversation with Dern came crashing in on his thoughts. What do my people think when they look upon me? Do they see a future leader devoted and intent upon their well-being? Or do they see an irresponsible child who neglects his duty? The fact that he couldn't answer that himself was troubling. So Asan decided he would set out to regain any respect lost during his winter of pouting, and he couldn't pass up this chance to do so now. "Father!" Asan called. Asan drew rein and turned to his son questioningly. "I wish to go with you. If our people are in danger, then I should be there with you to face it." His father considered it for a moment, then nodded. "Very well," the Kahra replied with a bemused look of curiosity for his son's sudden change. "But you will not ride at my side looking like that," he quipped, pointing to the mud-caked mess of Asan's clothes. "Go change quickly. I don't want this mysterious disturbance to catch us unaware." "Great Kahra!" Old Dern's voice interrupted. "Might I ask leave to join you as well? Who knows what tidings the spy might carry, and my vast knowledge could be of some use in uncovering the source of this mystery." Asan hesitated a moment before nodding. "Now hurry, both of you." The great chief turned his massive charger and rode away with Cho'Gath right behind. As Asan turned back in the direction of his tent, he caught a glimpse of Dern. The old goat was staring right at him with a look of approval, and the satisfaction in his shrewd grin spoke volumes. While it was doubtful Dern knew of these troubles ahead of time, it was obvious he was pivotal in Asan's newly found call to duty. No matter how hard he resisted, Asan always found himself manipulated in what Dern wanted. Resigned to that fact, Asan took off sprinting through the mud-filled paths. All attempts at stealth were forgotten as he slipped and slid through the muck. But none of it mattered. Today was the beginning of something new. Whether it was born from his new attempt to live up to his people's expectations, he wasn't certain. Either way, Asan could sense a change coming, and he was eager to face whatever challenges it brought in its wake.